The wedding dress was in a cedar chest at the back of her closet, folded in acid-free tissue paper with the kind of care that only a woman who worked with fabric her entire life would think to use. Ethan Mercer found it on the third day after his mother's funeral, when he had finally run out of ways to postpone going through her things and had to face the quiet, terrible reality of sorting a life into boxes. He was 31 years old, standing in a bedroom that still smelled like his mother's hand lotion and the faint metallic tang of sewing machine oil. And he was holding a dress that she had worn exactly once, on a day she never talked about, to marry a man who had left 12 years later without so much as a note on the kitchen table. It was ivory silk, hand-stitched, with seed pearl buttons running up the back and lace at the cuffs that Grace Mercer had tatted herself because she couldn't afford to buy it, and because she was the kind of woman who believed that if something was worth wearing, it was worth making with your own hands. Ethan held the dress up to the window light. It was beautiful. It was also, he would discover in approximately 4 minutes, worth more than every dollar his mother had earned in her entire life combined. The thread was the first thing he noticed. Not the lace, not the pearls, not the yellowed silk that had held its shape for 33 years in that cedar chest. The thread. A single line of stitching along the interior of the bodice lining that was different from the rest. Every other seam in the dress was sewn in ivory thread that matched the fabric so precisely you could barely see it. This one line was in pale blue. It was almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, and Ethan would not have known what to look for if he had not spent his childhood watching his mother sew, learning without realizing it, the grammar of her craft, the way she used color-coded threads, the way other people used filing systems. Ivory for structure, white for finishing, and pale blue, always pale blue, for the seams that hid something. "What are you doing?" Nora appeared in the doorway. She was 16, Ethan's younger sister by 15 years, a late and unexpected arrival who had been the single, unambiguous joy of Grace Mercer's difficult life. She had long, dark brown hair in a loose braid over one shoulder, sharp green eyes that she'd gotten from their father, a man she had no memory of and no interest in, and she was wearing a burgundy hoodie under a denim jacket covered in enamel pins that she collected from every thrift store and flea market she visited, which was all of them. Her beat-up black backpack was slung over one shoulder, also covered in pins, and she looked exactly like what she was, a teenager who was handling her grief by refusing to stand still. "Looking at Mom's wedding dress," Ethan said. "That's depressing." "Yeah." Nora came into the room and stood next to him. She touched the lace at the cuff with one finger, gently. "She made this?" "Every stitch." "Of course she did." Nora's voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. She had not cried at the funeral. She had not cried in the 3 days since. Ethan was not worried about this because he knew his sister, and he knew that Nora processed things the way their mother had processed things, slowly, privately, on her own schedule, and that when it came, it would come all at once, and he would need to be there, and he would be. "There's something weird with this seam," Ethan said. He ran his finger along the pale blue stitching. It ran the full length of the bodice lining, about 14 inches, and it was slightly raised, as though something flat had been inserted between the layers of fabric before the seam was closed. "Open it," Nora said. Ethan looked at her. "She's not going to wear it again, Ethan." The words came out harder than Nora intended, and she looked away immediately. "Sorry." "No, you're right." He went to Grace's sewing table, which occupied an entire corner of the bedroom, and found her smallest seam ripper, a delicate tool with a red handle that she'd owned for as long as Ethan could remember. He brought it back to the bed where the dress was laid out, and, with the careful precision of a man who had been taught to respect fabric by a woman who considered a crooked seam a moral failing, he opened the pale blue stitching. Inside the lining, pressed flat between 2 layers of silk, was a piece of paper. It was not ordinary paper. It was drafting vellum, the kind used by architects and engineers, thin and translucent, and almost indestructible. It had been folded once, precisely, and when Ethan unfolded it, both he and Nora stopped breathing. It was a map, hand-drawn in India ink, with the meticulous draftsmanship of someone trained in technical illustration. It showed a property, boundaries marked with measurements and compass bearings. There was a creek, rendered in fine blue ink, running diagonally across the lower third. There were tree lines indicated by small triangular marks. There was a structure labeled Spring House in block letters near the creek, and from the spring house a dotted line led to a small circle marked with a single word, below. In the bottom right corner, in handwriting that was not Grace's, but that shared her precision, someone had written, "Hale Property, Lot 14, Page County, Virginia, for my daughter, when the time is right." Ethan knew that handwriting. He had seen it exactly once before, on a birthday card that had arrived for him when he turned 7, mailed from an address in Luray, Virginia, signed simply, Grandpa Walt. His mother had taken the card from him after he read it, and he never saw another one. When he asked about Grandpa Walt, Grace changed the subject. When he asked again, she said, "Some doors stay closed, Ethan," in a tone that even a 7-year-old understood meant the conversation was over. Walter Hale, his mother's father. A man Grace had never taken him to visit, never spoken about except in the vaguest terms, and who had died, according to the single sentence Grace had offered, "A long time ago, before you were old enough to remember." Ethan had been 9. He had been old enough to remember plenty. He had simply not been given anything to remember. "Who's Grandpa Walt?" Nora asked, reading the map over his shoulder. "Mom's father. He died when I was 9. She never mentioned him. She never mentioned a lot of things." They stood in the bedroom, with the wedding dress spread across the bed, and the map in Ethan's hands, and the November afternoon light coming through the curtains, and Ethan felt something shift in the architecture of his understanding of his mother, a support beam moving, revealing a space behind it that he had not known was there. Grace Mercer had died on a Tuesday. "Heart failure," the doctor said, as though the heart were a machine that simply stopped running rather than an organ that had been quietly exhausted by decades of working too hard for too little. She was 54. She had been a seamstress her entire adult life, working from the small white clapboard house on Maple Street in Harrisonburg, Virginia, that she rented for $900 a month. She altered wedding dresses, repaired vintage clothing, and made custom pieces for a small clientele of women who appreciated hand-stitching and were willing to pay a modest premium for it. The word modest did a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Grace charged less than she should have for everything because she lived in perpetual anxiety about losing clients, which was the anxiety of a woman who had been left with 2 children and no safety net, and who understood in her bones that the distance between getting by and not getting by was exactly one lost customer. Ethan had grown up watching his mother work. The sewing room, which was also the living room, was filled with fabric bolts organized by color and weight. 3 dress forms named Margaret, Louise, and Helen, after characters in a novel Grace loved. A industrial Singer sewing machine that weighed approximately as much as a small automobile, and the particular organized chaos of a woman who could find any button, any thread, any notion in the room within 30 seconds, because the system made perfect sense to her, even if it looked like a fabric explosion to everyone else. Ethan had loved that room. He loved the sound of the sewing machine, a rhythmic mechanical purr that was the background music of his childhood. He loved the way Grace talked to the fabric, murmuring instructions as she guided it under the needle, as though the silk and cotton and linen were living things that needed encouragement. He loved that his mother could take something torn and make it whole, something plain and make it beautiful, something discarded, and make it wanted again. What Ethan had not loved was the money, or rather, the absence of it. Grace had raised 2 children on a seamstress's income supplemented by nothing. Their father, David Mercer, had been a long-haul truck driver who left when Ethan was 12 and Nora was not yet conceived. He had taken the savings account, the truck, and his favorite leather jacket, and he had left behind a mortgage payment he'd been 3 months behind on, a son who would spend years trying not to become him, and a woman who would eventually have a daughter with a man she dated briefly and who was never discussed, and who would raise that daughter with the same fierce, underfunded determination she brought to everything. Ethan worked his way through James Madison University, majoring in history because he loved it, and because the advisor who told him it was an impractical degree had obviously never met a Mercer, a family for whom impracticality was a genetic trait. He became a high school history teacher at Spotswood High School, where he taught APUS history and coached the academic quiz team, which had never won a regional tournament, but which had, under his guidance, developed a team spirit that their principal described as statistically improbable for a group of introverts. He made $38,000 a year. After rent on his apartment, after the payments on Grace's medical bills, which had accumulated like geological layers over her last 2 years, after groceries and gas, and Nora's school supplies and the electric bill, Ethan had approximately $52 of discretionary income per month. He kept track in a spreadsheet on his laptop because he was a millennial, and millennials budget in Google Sheets the way their grandfathers budgeted in leather ledgers, with the same anxious precision and the same quiet knowledge that the numbers would never be quite enough. Grace's death had simplified the finances in the cruel way that death simplifies things. There were fewer expenses now because there was one fewer person to feed and care for, but there was also the funeral, which cost $4,000 that Ethan did not have, and which he put on a credit card with a 23% interest rate because grief does not negotiate with lenders. Nora was living with Ethan now. This had been the arrangement for the last 6 months of Grace's life, when Grace had become too weak to manage the house alone, and Ethan had moved back into his childhood bedroom, which still had the glow-in-the-dark stars he'd stuck to the ceiling when he was 8. Nora had taken Grace's room. She had not changed anything in it. The dress forms still stood in the sewing corner. The measuring tape still hung from the hook by the door. The pin cushion, shaped like a tomato, still sat on the windowsill where Grace had left it. "We should go," Nora said, looking at the map. "Go where?" "To the property, Lot 14, Page County." She pointed at the map with the authority of someone who had already made the decision and was merely informing the relevant parties. "Mom hid this in her wedding dress, Ethan, in the lining, with a special thread. She wanted us to find it. She wanted someone to find it. We're the someone." Ethan looked at the map, at the careful draftsmanship, the precise measurements, the word below circled in ink that had not faded in what appeared to be decades. He thought about his mother sitting at her sewing machine, stitching this map into the only garment she owned that she would never alter, never cut, never give away, hiding it in the one place she knew would survive her. "Saturday," he said. "I'll call in." "You never call in." "I'm calling in." The drive from Harrisonburg to Page County was 45 minutes through the Shenandoah Valley in November, which meant the mountains were on fire with the last of the autumn color, the maples burning orange and the oaks holding their brown leaves like clenched fists, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that Virginia produces in late fall, so deep and clear it looked like something you could fall into. Ethan drove his mother's car, a 2011 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles and a passenger window that didn't roll down all the way. Grace had kept it immaculate. The interior smelled like her hand lotion, a cocoa butter scent that hit Ethan in the chest every time he got in, and that he was quietly terrified would eventually fade. Nora navigated using the map and her phone's GPS, cross-referencing the hand-drawn boundaries with satellite imagery. She was good at this. She was good at most things that required pattern recognition and spatial reasoning, which her geometry teacher said made her a natural mathematician, and which Nora said made her a natural thief, a career aspiration that she maintained ironically, but with enough conviction to keep Ethan mildly concerned. The property was off a county road called Hales Mill Lane, which was either a coincidence or a confirmation, and the road was unpaved for the last mile, narrowing to a track through a corridor of old-growth hardwoods that closed overhead like the roof of a cathedral. The land opened up on the other side into a rolling meadow bordered by stone walls that someone had built a very long time ago with the patient skill of a person who understood that walls built well outlast the people who build them. "This is it," Nora said, looking from the map to the meadow. "Lot 14. Ethan stopped the car. They got out. The air was cold and smelled like creek water and fallen leaves and the particular mineral sweetness of Virginia soil in November. The meadow sloped gently downward toward a tree line, and beyond the tree line, Ethan could hear water moving. They followed the map. Down the slope, through a gap in the stone wall where a wooden gate had once hung and now lay rotted on the ground, through a stand of sycamores whose white bark glowed in the morning light like bones, and there, beside a creek that ran clear and fast over a bed of river stones, was the spring house. It was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, built from the same fieldstone as the walls, with a slate roof that was mostly intact and a low wooden door that was swollen shut. The stones were dressed with a precision that spoke of professional training, each one fitted to its neighbors with minimal mortar, the joints tight and even. Moss covered the north-facing wall in a carpet of emerald green, and ferns grew from the cracks near the foundation, where the creek kept the earth permanently damp. "That's it," Nora whispered. She looked at Ethan. "The spring house." Ethan looked at the map. The dotted line ran from the spring house to the circle labeled "below." He folded the map and put it in the inside pocket of his olive canvas jacket, next to the leather satchel strap that crossed his chest. He was wearing a gray Henley under the jacket, dark jeans, and worn brown boots, and he looked like what he was, a high school teacher who made $38,000 a year and who was standing on a piece of land that was about to rearrange his entire understanding of his family. The door required a shoulder. Ethan put his weight against it, and it gave with a wet, reluctant groan. Inside, the spring house was exactly what it appeared to be. A single room with a stone-lined channel running through the center where creek water had once been diverted to keep milk and butter cold. The channel was dry now, the diversion long since silted up. The walls were bare stone. The floor was stone. The air was cool and smelled like wet rock and thyme. "There's nothing here," Nora said, her voice careful with the effort of not being disappointed. But Ethan was looking at the floor, specifically at a section of the floor near the back wall where the stones were laid in a slightly different pattern from the rest. The main floor was random coursed fieldstone, irregular shapes fitted together like a puzzle. But this section, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, was laid in a concentric pattern, stones arranged in rings radiating outward from a center point like a target. It was subtle. You would never notice it unless you had spent your childhood watching a woman who organized everything by pattern, who color-coded her threads and arranged her buttons by size and shape, who believed that order was a form of love. "Nora, look at the floor." She looked. She saw it immediately because she was her mother's daughter. "That's not random." "No." Ethan knelt beside the concentric pattern. The center stone was round, about the size of a dinner plate, and it was slightly higher than the surrounding stones, as though it had been placed last, pressed into position like a keystone. He tried to grip it. His fingers slipped on the smooth surface. "Try turning it," Nora said, "like a lid." He pressed down and turned counterclockwise. The stone rotated smoothly on a hidden pin, turning 90 degrees with a soft grinding sound and then dropping about an inch into a recessed channel. A seam appeared in the floor, running the full perimeter of the concentric section. Ethan and Nora looked at each other. He got his fingers into the seam and lifted. The entire section, 3 feet square and 4 inches thick, hinged upward on a concealed iron pivot, revealing a shaft of cool air and the top of a stone staircase descending into darkness. "I'm going first," Nora said. "Absolutely not. I'm smaller. If it collapses, you can pull me out." "That's not how structural engineering works. You teach history, not engineering. Move." Ethan went first. He turned on his phone flashlight and descended. The stairs were narrow, each step cut from solid stone with the same precision as the springhouse walls. He counted 12 steps. The air grew cooler but remained dry, which meant ventilation, which meant someone had engineered this space to last. At the bottom, his flashlight found a wooden beam across the ceiling and mounted to the beam, an old ceramic light fixture with a pull chain. He pulled it. The bulb, impossibly, came on. A warm amber glow spread through the space like sunrise. Ethan Mercer stood in his grandfather's vault and understood, in a single overwhelming moment, why his mother had never talked about Walter Hale. The room was roughly 20 feet by 15, carved into the hillside beneath the springhouse. The walls were lined with stone, dressed and fitted with the same meticulous craftsmanship as everything Walter Hale had built. But it was what the walls held that stopped Ethan's breath. Shelves, wooden shelves, built from cherry, sanded smooth, running the full length of both long walls. On the shelves, arranged in rows with identification cards in precise handwriting, were geological specimens. Not ordinary rocks, minerals, crystals, gemstones. Hundreds of them, each in a custom-fitted wooden cradle, each labeled with species, location of collection, date, and estimated value. Ethan moved along the shelves in a slow daze. Sapphires from a site in Montana, emeralds from a deposit in North Carolina that the card noted had been closed to collection since 1987. Tourmalines in colors that ranged from watermelon pink to deep forest green. A shelf of opals that caught the amber light and fractured it into tiny rainbows across the stone walls. A collection of alexandrites, rare enough that the identification card for one of them noted, in Walter's precise handwriting, one of approximately 30 known specimens of this quality. "Ethan." Nora's voice was very small. She was standing at the far end of the room, in front of a heavy wooden desk that sat against the back wall. On the desk was a wooden filing cabinet, the old-fashioned kind with brass handles, and next to it, a leather portfolio tied with a cotton ribbon. Ethan walked to the desk. He opened the filing cabinet. Inside, arranged in hanging folders with typed labels, were documents, land surveys, property deeds, mineral rights assessments, geological survey reports from the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, tax records going back to 1958, and in the back of the second drawer, in a folder labeled "Do Not File" for Grace, a thick envelope containing a handwritten letter. Ethan opened the letter. Nora read it over his shoulder. "My dear Grace," the letter began. "By the time you read this, I will have been gone long enough that it's safe. I need to explain everything I couldn't explain while I was alive, and I need you to understand that every decision I made was to protect you and whoever comes after you." Walter Hale had been a geological surveyor for the Commonwealth of Virginia for 31 years. He had spent his career mapping the mineral deposits of the Shenandoah Valley and the Blue Ridge, and in the process he had developed an expertise in gemology that few people outside the academic world knew about. His collection, the one now sitting on shelves in this vault, had been assembled over 4 decades from sites he had surveyed professionally, collected from legally, and documented with the compulsive thoroughness of a man who had always known that someday someone would question where the stones came from, and he wanted the answer to be unimpeachable. But the gemstones were not the real treasure. The real treasure was the land. Lot 14, the 40 acres that the map described, sat on top of one of the most significant undeveloped lithium deposits in the eastern United States. Walter had identified the deposit in 1986 during a routine survey, long before lithium had become the critical mineral of the 21st century, long before electric vehicles and battery storage had turned it into something that companies and governments would pay extraordinary sums to access. He had filed the mineral rights in his own name, through a trust, and he had told no one. No one except Raymond. Raymond Hale was Walter's son, Grace's older brother. He was 11 years older than Grace, and he had been, according to the letter, the great disappointment of my life, which is something no father should ever have to write about his own child, but which I write because it is true. Raymond had discovered the geological surveys in Walter's office when Walter was 63 and beginning to show signs of the Parkinson's disease that would eventually take his life. Raymond had understood immediately what the lithium deposit was worth. He had spent the next 3 years trying to convince Walter to sell the mineral rights to a mining consortium called Appalachian Resource Partners, a company in which Raymond had quietly acquired a financial interest. Walter refused. The letter explained why. He had seen what mining did to the Shenandoah Valley. He had spent his career documenting the geology of this land, and he believed that some things were worth more intact than extracted. He also did not trust Raymond. He did not trust Raymond because Raymond had, on 2 previous occasions, attempted to forge Walter's signature on property documents, and because Raymond had, on a 3rd occasion, attempted to have Walter declared mentally incompetent in order to gain power of attorney over his assets. So Walter built the vault. He built it beneath the spring house because the spring house was on the most remote corner of Lot 14, accessible only by the creek path, invisible from the road. He moved the gemstone collection there, 1 case at a time, over the course of a year. He moved the original property documents, the mineral rights filings, the geological surveys that proved the lithium deposit's existence and value. He sealed everything behind the stone mechanism in the floor, a mechanism designed by a man who had spent 3 decades working with stone and earth, and who understood precisely how to build something that would endure. Then he gave the property to Grace, not officially, because an official transfer would have appeared in county records that Raymond monitored. Instead, he established a blind trust, administered by a lawyer in Luray named Henry Farwell, and he placed Lot 14 into the trust with Grace as the sole beneficiary. Raymond never knew. Henry Farwell never told him, because Henry Farwell was the kind of small-town lawyer who took attorney-client privilege personally and who regarded Raymond Hale with the specific contempt that honest men reserve for dishonest ones. Walter died when Ethan was 9. The Parkinsons had taken his hands first, which was the cruelty that Walter himself had noted in the letter was the hardest to bear, because his hands had been his instruments, and his identity, and his means of building the things he loved. Grace had visited him in his final months. She had gone alone, telling Ethan she was visiting a friend. She had sat with her father, and he had told her everything: the vault, the trust, the lithium deposit, Raymond's betrayal. And he had asked her to keep it secret until it was safe. "When is it safe?" Grace had asked. "When Raymond gives up," Walter had said, "or when you're sure Ethan is strong enough to fight him." Grace had kept the secret for 22 years. She had sewn the map into her wedding dress because it was the one possession she would never discard, the one garment that no client would ever ask her to alter, the one piece of fabric in her life that served no practical purpose and therefore would never be disturbed by the daily demands of practicality. She had used the pale blue thread as a signal that only someone who knew her system would recognize. She had trusted that Ethan, who had grown up watching her work, would see the thread, would understand what it meant, would open the seam. She had been right. Ethan sat on the floor of the vault with the letter in his hands and wept. He wept for his mother, who had spent her entire adult life pretending to be poor while sitting on a fortune she couldn't touch. He wept for his grandfather, who had built this room with hands that were failing him, stone by stone, to protect a family from a son he couldn't trust. He wept for the years of anxiety, the spreadsheets, the $52 of monthly discretionary income, the credit card funeral, all of it unnecessary, all of it the cost of a secret that had been kept too well and too long. Nora sat next to him on the stone floor. She did not say anything. She put her head on his shoulder, and they sat in the amber light of their grandfather's vault, surrounded by gemstones and documents, and the evidence of a love that had expressed itself in silence and stone, and they let the weight of it settle. The crying lasted longer than Ethan expected, not the dramatic, gasping kind of crying that happens in movies, the slow, heavy kind that happens in real life, the kind that comes from somewhere below the chest and moves through the body like weather, unstoppable and necessary. He cried for the moment in the lawyer's office when Grace's medical bills had first been explained to him and he had felt his entire future contract to the size of a monthly payment. He cried for the nights he had lain in bed, calculating whether he could afford to buy Nora new sneakers or whether she would have to wear the ones with the peeling sole for another month. He cried for his mother's hands, which had been strong and quick and beautiful, and which had spent 54 years making beautiful things for other people, while carrying a secret that must have weighed more than any fabric bolt in that sewing room. When he stopped crying, he felt emptied. Not empty. Emptied. There is a difference. Empty is the absence of something that was never there. Emptied is the absence of something that was there for a long time and is now gone, leaving a space that is clean and ready and waiting to be filled with something else. He blew his nose on his sleeve because he had not thought to bring tissues to an underground vault, and Nora handed him a crumpled napkin from her backpack pocket without comment, which was the most loving thing anyone had done for him in weeks. It took Nora approximately 15 minutes to stop crying, and approximately 3 additional minutes to begin calculating. She was her mother's daughter, but she was also a teenager in the 21st century, and she had her phone out and was Googling lithium deposit value per acre Virginia before Ethan had finished wiping his eyes. "Ethan," she said, in a voice that had gone very controlled and very precise, "do you know what lithium is worth right now?" "Conceptually, yes." "I'm not asking conceptually, I'm asking per metric ton." "I teach history, Nora." "Current spot price is about $28,000 per metric ton, and according to this geological survey report," she held up one of the documents from the filing cabinet, "this deposit is estimated to contain approximately 85,000 metric tons of lithium carbonate equivalent." She did the math on her phone. Ethan watched her face change. "The mineral rights alone," Nora said slowly, "are worth conservatively, very conservatively, somewhere in the range of $2.4 billion. The number sat in the vault like a third person. "But that's extraction value," Nora added, because she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "The mineral rights themselves, if licensed to a mining company, would be worth a fraction of that, but a large fraction." She looked at a second document. Grandpa Walt's estimate, which he wrote in 2009, put the licensing value at between $40 and $70 million. That was 17 years ago. Lithium prices have quadrupled since then. Ethan looked at the shelves of gemstones. "And these." Nora walked along the shelves, reading identification cards. She stopped at a case near the center of the left wall. This alexandrite alone. The card says it's 8.7 carats, eye clean, with strong color change. She Googled again. Her eyes widened. High-quality alexandrites over 5 carats sell for $50,000 to $70,000 per carat at auction. So, that one stone is worth around $500,000, and there are over 400 specimens in here. The gemstone collection, when it was eventually appraised by a certified gemologist named Dr. Susan Park from the Gemological Institute of America, would be valued at $14.6 million. The mineral rights, when assessed by a geological consulting firm called Meridian Earth Sciences, would be valued at approximately $187 million based on current lithium market conditions and projected demand curves through 2040. But before any of that could happen, Raymond Hale showed up. He came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Ethan and Nora had found the vault. Ethan had not told anyone about the discovery. He had contacted Henry Farwell's successor, a young attorney named Diana Tran, who had inherited Farwell's practice after his retirement, and who had the trust documents in a fireproof safe in her office in Luray. Diana had confirmed everything. The trust was valid. The mineral rights were filed correctly. The property belonged to Grace, and now, through Grace's will, to Ethan and Nora. Raymond drove up Hale's Mill Lane in a silver Range Rover that looked aggressively out of place on the unpaved road. He was 61 years old, tall and gaunt, with steel-gray hair cropped military short, a sharp, angular face that looked like it had been designed for disapproval, and cold gray eyes that reminded Ethan of river stones, smooth and hard and completely without warmth. He wore a dark green waxed jacket, the kind that cost $400, and was meant to suggest a relationship with the outdoors that was primarily financial, pressed dark pants, and expensive hiking boots that had never hiked. Ethan was at the spring house when Raymond appeared at the edge of the meadow. Nora was at school. Ethan had taken to visiting the property on his free mornings, not to do anything in particular, but because being there, on land that his grandfather had protected and his mother had kept secret, felt like a form of conversation with people he could no longer talk to. Ethan. Raymond's voice preceded him down the slope. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "We need to talk about this property." Ethan stood up from the stone wall he'd been sitting on. He had never met Raymond. Grace had made sure of that, but he recognized the face from a single photograph he'd found in the vault, a family portrait from 1978 in which a teenage Raymond stood next to a young Grace, and behind them both, Walter Hale, in a wool vest and work shirt, his hands resting on Grace's shoulders. "How did you know I was here?" Ethan asked. "Page County is a small place. The Farwell woman mentioned the trust had been activated." Diana Tran. "Whatever her name is. The point is, this land has been in the Hale family for 4 generations. Your mother had no right to keep it from the family." "My mother was the family." Raymond's jaw tightened. He looked past Ethan at the spring house. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of calculation, of hunger, that was so brief and so controlled that Ethan almost missed it. "What's in the spring house?" Raymond asked. "Water used to be. Now just stones." "Don't be clever with me, son. I know what my father found on this land. I've known for 30 years. He was a stubborn old fool who couldn't see past his own sentimentality, and your mother was worse. She sat on this property for 22 years while you ate peanut butter sandwiches and drove a car with 200,000 miles on it. She let you struggle. She let your sister grow up without anything. And for what? To spite me?" Ethan felt something cold and precise settle into his chest. It was not anger. Anger was hot and reactive. This was something else. This was the feeling of understanding, with absolute clarity, exactly who was standing in front of him and exactly what they were capable of. She did it to protect us, Ethan said. From you. Raymond took a step forward. I have a consortium ready to develop this land. The mineral rights alone are worth a fortune that you cannot possibly manage responsibly. You're a high school teacher. You grade papers for a living. I'm offering to handle the licensing negotiations, take a reasonable management fee, and ensure that the family benefits. The way you ensured that Grandpa Walt benefited? Through the shell company? Through the forged signatures? Raymond went still. The color drained from his face so quickly that for a moment Ethan thought the man might actually faint. He documented everything, Raymond. Every transaction. Every forged document. Every attempt to have him declared incompetent. It's all in the vault. In his handwriting. With dates and witnesses and copies of the filings. The silence between them was vast. A hawk circled overhead. The creek murmured. The Shenandoah Valley stretched away behind them in ridges of blue and gold. You're making a mistake, Raymond said. But his voice had changed. The authority was gone. What remained was the voice of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a dead man's patience. I don't think I am. Raymond left. His Range Rover fishtailed on the gravel as he turned around, which Ethan noted was the first genuinely honest thing Raymond had done in the entire conversation. The restraining order was granted within a week. Raymond's attorney, a man from Richmond who charged $600 an hour and who had apparently not been briefed on the contents of Walter's documentation, withdrew his client's contest after Diana presented the first 40 pages of evidence. There were over 300 pages total. Walter Hale had built his legal defense the same way he had built his vault, stone by stone, with patience and precision, each piece fitted to the next, the whole structure designed to withstand exactly the kind of pressure that Raymond would eventually apply. The people of Page County, who had known Walter Hale as a quiet man who kept to himself and who built beautiful stone walls for anyone who asked, absorbed the news of the vault with the particular lack of surprise that rural communities display when a neighbor turns out to have been more than they appeared. He was always carrying rocks, said Earl Dinwiddie, who owned the feed store on Route 340 and who had sold Walter burlap sacks by the dozen for 40 years. I figured he was building something, didn't know it was underground, but that tracks. Walt was never much for showing off. The local paper ran a story. Then the Charlottesville Daily Progress picked it up. Then the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Ethan declined all interview requests. He was a private man, like his mother, like his grandfather, and he saw no reason to perform his family's story for strangers when the story had been designed, from the beginning, to be private. Diana Tran handled everything. She was 34, precise, and possessed of the particular tenacity that small-town lawyers develop when they spend their careers protecting people who can't afford big firm representation. She filed for a restraining order against Raymond based on Walter's documented history of forgery and harassment. She engaged Meridian Earth Sciences for the mineral rights assessment. She connected Ethan with a financial advisory firm in Charlottesville that specialized in managing sudden wealth for clients who, as the lead advisor put it, with a gentleness that suggested he'd had this conversation before, did not grow up expecting this. Ethan did not lease the mineral rights immediately. He would, eventually. Diana was in discussions with 3 companies, all of which had offered terms that would have made Walter Hale's head spin. But Ethan was not in a hurry. He had learned from his mother that patience was not the same as inaction, and from his grandfather that some things are worth more when you wait for the right conditions. What Ethan did immediately was pay off Grace's medical bills, all of them. Every invoice, every collection notice, every balance that had been quietly destroying his credit score for 2 years. He wrote the final check at the kitchen table in Grace's house on Maple Street, sitting in Grace's chair, under the light of the lamp she had used for close sewing work, and when he put the pen down, He felt something release in his shoulders that he had been carrying for so long it had become part of his posture. He established trusts for Nora's education and for his own future. He did not quit his teaching job. His principal, a dry-humored woman named Dr. Carolyn Reeves, would have been surprised if he had. "You're not the quitting kind," she told him when he asked for a personal day. "That's either your best quality or your worst, and I've never been able to decide which." He kept Grace's house. He kept the sewing room exactly as it was, the fabric bolts, the dress forms, the singer, the tomato pincushion on the windowsill. Nora asked him once if they were going to redecorate. He said no. She said good. The gemstone collection was insured and placed in a climate-controlled facility at the University of Virginia's Geology Department, on loan, where Dr. Susan Park used it as a teaching collection, and where graduate students studied Walter Hale's meticulous documentation methods as a model of field cataloging. Ethan visited once a month. He stood in front of the alexandrite that was worth $500,000 and thought about his grandfather carrying it down 12 stone steps in a spring house, tucking it into a velvet-lined cradle with hands that were already beginning to shake. Nora graduated from Spotswood High School 2 years later, third in her class, and enrolled at Virginia Tech to study geological engineering, a choice that surprised no one who had watched her read her grandfather's survey reports with the intensity of a person discovering a language she had always known but never been taught. She took the map with her. She had it framed professionally in a simple black frame, and she hung it on the wall of her dorm room next to a photograph of Grace at her sewing machine, taken by Ethan when he was 14, in which Grace is looking down at a piece of fabric with an expression of such complete and tender concentration that everyone who sees the photograph assumes she is looking at a child. Her roommate, a chemical engineering major from Northern Virginia named Priya, asked about the map on the first day. Nora told her the short version. Priya listened to the entire story, sitting cross-legged on her bed, with her mouth slightly open, and then said, "Your family is absolutely insane, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." They became best friends immediately. Nora called Ethan every Sunday. The calls lasted between 45 minutes and 2 hours, depending on whether Nora had discovered something new in her coursework that connected to Walter's surveys. She had begun a research project in her sophomore year, supervised by a professor named Dr. Richard Okoro, analyzing Walter's geological documentation methods and comparing them to modern digital surveying techniques. Dr. Okoro, who had been surveying Virginia geology for 25 years and who thought he had seen everything, told Nora that her grandfather's field notes were among the most precise analog geological documents he had ever encountered. "He was doing by hand," Dr. Okoro said, "what takes us 3 satellites and a computer to replicate, and honestly, his margin of error was smaller." Nora included this quote in her research paper. She also included a footnote that read, "Walter Hale's documentation practices appear to have been motivated not only by scientific rigor, but by an awareness that his records might one day need to serve as legal evidence. This dual purpose, scientific and protective, represents a unique case study in the intersection of geological fieldwork and estate planning." Her professor wrote "remarkable" in the margin and circled it twice. Ethan began restoring the spring house. He did much of the work himself, not because he couldn't hire someone, but because there was something in the act of fitting stone to stone that felt like learning a language his grandfather had spoken. He repointed the walls. He replaced the slate tiles that had slipped from the roof. He cleared the creek diversion channel and watched the water return, cold and clear, running over the stones with the particular sound that moving water makes when it's going exactly where it's supposed to go. He did not excavate the vault further or expand it. He left it as Walter had built it, with the shelves and the desk and the filing cabinet and the light fixture with the pull chain. He added one thing, a framed photograph of Grace, placed on Walter's desk, facing the door. In the photograph, Grace is young, maybe 25, and she is laughing. Ethan does not know what she was laughing at. He found the photograph in a box of Grace's things that Catherine's sister had kept. It does not matter what the joke was. What matters is the laugh, which is wide and real and unguarded. The laugh of a woman who has not yet learned all the things that would teach her to be careful. On a Saturday in October, a year after the discovery, Ethan drove Nora to Page County. They parked at the end of Hales Mill Lane and walked the meadow together, through the gap in the stone wall, through the sycamores, to the spring house. Ethan had packed a thermos of coffee and 2 of the oatmeal cookies that Grace used to make from a recipe card she kept in the kitchen drawer, handwritten, stained with butter. Nora had made the cookies herself. They were not as good as Grace's. They were close enough. They sat on the stone wall above the creek and drank coffee and ate cookies and watched the water move over the rocks in patterns that were never exactly the same twice. A red-tailed hawk crossed the valley below them, its wings tilted against a thermal, spiraling upward with the effortless patience of a creature that understands that altitude is just time made visible. Ethan watched it climb. He thought about his mother at her sewing machine, guiding fabric under the needle with the same patience, the same understanding that the thing you're making takes as long as it takes, and you do not rush it, because rushing is how you break threads and lose stitches and create the kind of mistakes that show. He thought about his grandfather in this vault, in the amber light, placing stones into walls with hands that were beginning to betray him, fitting each one precisely because precision was not a luxury for Walter Hale, it was a language, and this vault was the longest and most important sentence he would ever construct. 22 years of building, 22 years of descending those 12 steps, oiling the hinges, checking the specimens, adding another document to the filing cabinet, another stone to the wall, another small act of construction in a project that had no audience and no deadline and no reward except the knowledge that someday, when the right person opened the right seam in the right dress, all of it would matter. Grace had understood this. She had understood it because she was a builder too, in her way. Every dress she altered, every seam she sewed, every button she replaced was an act of making something whole, making something last, making something worthy of the person who would wear it. She had spent her life in service to other people's garments, while hiding the most important garment of all in a cedar chest at the back of her closet. The irony was not lost on Ethan. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing Grace would have appreciated, quietly, privately, with the smallest possible smile. Nora dunked her cookie in her coffee, which was a thing Grace used to do, and which Ethan chose not to mention because some inheritances are better left unnarrated. She knew, Nora said. She knew we'd find it. Yeah. The pale blue thread. She knew you'd see it. Ethan nodded. He had thought about this every day since the discovery. His mother, sitting at her sewing machine in the living room on Maple Street, stitching a map into a wedding dress with a thread that was a message, trusting that her son, who had grown up in that room, who had learned the grammar of her craft without knowing he was learning it, would one day pick up the dress, see the thread, and understand. She raised us to find it, Ethan said. Every time she showed me a seam, every time she explained why she used a different color thread, she was teaching me to read the map. Nora was quiet for a while. Then she said, "That's the most mom thing I've ever heard." Yeah, it is. The Shenandoah Valley lay before them in the late afternoon light, ridge after ridge of blue and gold, the same view that Walter Hale had looked at when he chose this piece of land to protect, the same view that Grace Mercer had never seen because she had never allowed herself to visit, because visiting would have meant risking the secret, and Grace had decided that her children's future was worth more than her own comfort. Ethan Mercer started with a wedding dress and a pale blue thread. What he found wasn't just gemstones and mineral rights and a vault built by a grandfather he never knew. It was the proof that love doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like poverty. Sometimes it looks like a woman sewing a map into the lining of a dress she'll never wear again, trusting that the person she made it for will know how to read her stitches. Somewhere right now, someone is holding something that belonged to their mother, or their father, or their grandmother, and they're about to put it in a box and take it to Goodwill because they think it's just an old dress, or just an old coat, or just an old book with nothing written in the margins. Check the seams. Check the lining. Check the pale blue thread. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the things your family left behind, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tell me in the comments, have you ever found something hidden in a piece of clothing? We read every single one. See you in the next one.